I didn't mean it like that. It just slipped out. But apparently, saying you miss your ex in bed is some kind of betrayal now. I'm sitting on my cousin's lumpy couch at 2 in the morning, eating gas station chips and staring at my phone, wondering how one sentence could destroy an entire relationship in the span of 3 hours. The guest room smells like baby powder and disappointment, and I can hear my cousin's husband snoring through the thin walls. This isn't exactly where I pictured myself sleeping tonight when I woke up in Ryan's bed this morning. The evening had started so perfectly. Ryan had cooked dinner, we'd opened a bottle of wine, and everything felt comfortable and intimate in that way that makes you forget to filter your thoughts. We'd been together for 8 months, long enough that I thought we could be honest about everything, including our pasts. That was my first mistake, thinking that honesty was always the right choice, even when it involved comparing your current partner to someone who came before them. I'd had just enough wine to feel relaxed and uninhibited, which in hindsight was the perfect storm for saying something catastrophically stupid. We'd moved to the bedroom around 10, and things were progressing the way they usually did with Ryan. He was sweet and considerate, exactly the kind of partner that any reasonable woman would appreciate. But as we were getting more intimate, my wine-clouded brain started making comparisons that I should have kept to myself. That's when it happened. In the middle of what should have been a romantic moment, the words just tumbled out of my mouth before I could stop them. I told Ryan that I missed how my ex Ethan used to do things. Not just missed him as a person, but specifically missed his technique and approach to intimacy. The effect was immediate and devastating. Ryan went completely still, like someone had pressed a pause button on his entire body. The warmth and connection we'd been building evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold silence that made my stomach drop with the realization of what I'd just said. I tried to laugh it off, telling Ryan that it was just muscle memory talking and that I didn't mean anything serious by the comparison. I said it was like preferring one restaurant's pasta over another's, just a matter of personal taste and familiarity, nothing that reflected on him as a person or partner. But Ryan didn't laugh. He didn't even look at me. He just got up from the bed and started putting his clothes on with mechanical efficiency, like he was getting ready for work, rather than dealing with relationship drama. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications that I was only beginning to understand. I kept trying to explain that the comment had just slipped out, that it wasn't a judgment on our relationship or his abilities. I said I was probably just feeling nostalgic because I'd seen Ethan at a coffee shop earlier that week, and that running into an ex always stirred up weird feelings that didn't mean anything important. Ryan finished getting dressed and walked out of the bedroom without saying a single word to me. I heard him moving around the apartment, opening and closing doors, and the sound of his car keys jingling. For a moment, I thought he was leaving to cool off, maybe planning to come back when he was ready to talk about what had happened. But when Ryan returned 20 minutes later, he was carrying an empty box from the storage room. He set it down by the bedroom door and told me to pack my things because I needed to be out of the apartment within the hour. His voice was calm and final, in a way that made my blood turn cold. I couldn't believe Ryan was being so dramatic about what was obviously just a thoughtless comment made in an intimate moment. I tried to explain that what I'd said didn't reflect my actual feelings about our relationship or my commitment to building a future together. The truth was, Ethan had been technically better at certain things. That wasn't Ryan's fault. Ethan and I had been together for 3 years, so naturally he'd learn my preferences and develop techniques that worked specifically for me. Ryan and I were still figuring each other out, and I'd thought that sharing some guidance might actually help improve our intimacy. I'd always believed that vulnerability was supposed to be part of a healthy relationship. All the articles I'd read about building strong partnerships emphasized the importance of honest communication, even about difficult topics. I thought I was being mature by acknowledging areas where we could grow together. Ryan had always been a little insecure about my romantic history, especially when it came to Ethan. He'd ask questions about our relationship and then get quiet and moody when I answered honestly. I'd tried to reassure him that the past was the past, but I could tell he was always comparing himself to someone he'd never even met. Maybe that's why my comment had hit him so hard. It wasn't just about the specific thing I'd said, but about confirming his worst fears, that I was constantly measuring him against my ex and finding him lacking. But that wasn't fair. Everyone has preferences based on their experiences, and pretending otherwise seemed dishonest and artificial. I'd been comparing them, sure, but not in a malicious way. I genuinely wanted our physical relationship to improve, and I thought sharing some insight about what had worked well in the past might help us develop better intimacy together. Isn't that what couples are supposed to do? Communicate about their needs and desires. The wine had definitely lowered my inhibitions and made me more direct than I might have been otherwise. But alcohol doesn't create thoughts that weren't already there. It just makes you more likely to express them. The comparison had been in my mind for months, and maybe it was better that it was finally out in the open where we could address it. Ryan was acting like I'd committed some unforgivable betrayal, but all I'd done was be honest about my feelings and experiences. If he couldn't handle knowing that I'd had good relationships before him, maybe he wasn't mature enough for the kind of adult partnership I was looking for. I tried explaining all of this while I watched him stand there with his arms crossed, waiting for me to fill the box with my belongings. But Ryan seemed completely closed off to any rational discussion about what had happened. He'd made up his mind that this was unforgivable, and nothing I said was going to change that. The speed with which he'd decided to end our relationship was shocking and hurtful. We'd been talking about moving to a bigger apartment together, maybe even getting engaged next year. But apparently, all of that could be destroyed by one poorly timed comment during an intimate moment. I kept thinking he'd calm down and realize he was overreacting once he had time to process what had really happened. This was obviously just a heat-of-the-moment response to being hurt and embarrassed. By tomorrow morning, he'd probably be ready to have a mature conversation about how we could work through this misunderstanding. But Ryan's expression never softened, and he never wavered in his demand that I pack my things and leave immediately. He stood there watching me gather my clothes and personal items, like he was supervising the departure of an unwelcome houseguest rather than the woman he'd been planning a future with just hours earlier. I tried calling my best friend Sarah as I stuffed clothes into the box, hoping she'd let me crash on her couch until Ryan came to his senses and asked me to come back. But when I explained what had happened, Sarah's response was almost as devastating as Ryan's reaction. Sarah asked me if I'd really said that out loud, and when I confirmed that I had, she went quiet for a long moment before saying she couldn't help me tonight because she had an early meeting tomorrow. The subtext was clear. She thought I'd crossed a line too, and she didn't want to get involved in the drama I'd created. I tried reaching out to other friends, but most of them didn't answer their phones at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. The few who did respond seemed uncomfortable when I explained why I needed somewhere to stay, and nobody offered to come pick me up or let me stay over. My ex Ethan was the obvious person to call, since he was technically responsible for the comment that had gotten me into this mess. But when I texted him explaining the situation, he left me on read without responding. Apparently, being told that someone missed your sexual technique wasn't flattering enough to warrant helping that person find emergency housing. I'd been planning to post something on social media about the absurdity of being kicked out over an honest comment. Maybe frame it as a funny story about male insecurity and unrealistic expectations. But when I tried to craft the post, it came out sounding desperate and bitter rather than amusing. The few responses I got were mostly people asking for more details about what exactly I'd said, and when I provided context, the comments turned judgmental rather than supportive. Even my online friends seemed to think I'd made a serious mistake rather than just expressing an innocent preference. Ryan stayed in the living room while I packed, occasionally checking his watch like he was timing how long I was taking to get out of his apartment. There was no discussion about logistics or when I might be able to come back for anything I'd forgotten. This wasn't a temporary cooling-off period, it was a permanent eviction. I kept hoping he'd change his mind at the last minute, maybe realize that kicking me out in the middle of the night was an extreme response to what had basically been a communication problem. but Ryan seemed more determined than ever to get me out of his space as quickly as possible. When I couldn't fit everything into the one box, Ryan found me a garbage bag for the overflow. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I was literally packing my life into trash bags because I'd been honest about missing aspects of a previous relationship. My cousin Lisa was the only person who answered her phone and offered to help, though she sounded less than thrilled about having an unexpected houseguest. She said I could sleep on the couch in her guest room, but warned me that her husband was a light sleeper and her toddler woke up early, so I'd need to be quiet and unobtrusive. Lisa arrived 30 minutes later in her pajamas and a coat, clearly annoyed about being dragged out of bed to rescue me from my own poor judgment. She helped me carry my boxes and bags to her car without asking for details about what had happened, which I appreciated but also found ominous. Ryan held the apartment door open while Lisa and I made multiple trips to load my belongings into her car. He didn't say goodbye or good luck or anything that acknowledged the 8 months we'd spent building a relationship together. I was just another problem that had been efficiently removed from his life. The drive to Lisa's house was awkward and humiliating, with me trying to explain what had happened without making myself sound worse than I already did. Lisa listened without commenting, but I could tell from her expression that she thought I'd made a spectacularly poor decision. Lisa's guest room was barely big enough for the fold-out couch and my boxes, and the walls were covered with cheerful nursery decorations that made my situation feel even more pathetic. I was a grown woman sleeping among stuffed animals because I couldn't keep my mouth shut during intimate moments. I spent most of the night lying awake, replaying the conversation with Ryan and trying to figure out where everything had gone wrong. The comment that had seemed so innocent in my wine-influenced state now felt obviously cruel and inappropriate. But it was too late to take it back. The next morning, I woke up to Lisa's toddler staring at me through the guest room door, probably wondering why there was a stranger sleeping in his playroom. Lisa brought me coffee and gently suggested that I might want to start looking for a more permanent housing solution, since her family needed their space back. I tried texting Ryan again, crafting what I thought was a thoughtful apology that acknowledged his hurt feelings while explaining my perspective on what had happened. But the message wouldn't deliver, and when I tried calling, it went straight to voicemail. He'd blocked my number completely. My attempts to reach out through social media were equally unsuccessful. Ryan had unfriended me on all platforms and apparently asked our mutual friends to do the same, because I was suddenly excluded from group chats and event invitations that I'd been part of for months. The isolation was swift and comprehensive. People I'd considered close friends were suddenly unavailable when I tried to make plans, and my text messages were met with brief, polite responses that made it clear I was no longer welcome in my former social circle. I'd thought some of my friends would be neutral about what had happened, maybe even sympathetic to my side of the story, but it seemed like Ryan had gotten to them first with his version of events, and they'd all decided that I was the villain who'd cruelly compared him to my ex during intimate moments. Even my co-workers seemed to know something had happened, though I wasn't sure how the story had reached my professional life. People were polite but distant, and I noticed that I was no longer included in casual lunch invitations or after-work social events. The speed with which my entire social network had collapsed was shocking and devastating. I'd gone from having a busy social calendar and active friend group to being essentially friendless in the span of a week, all because of one comment that I'd thought was relatively minor. I tried reaching out to old friends from college and high school, people who wouldn't know Ryan or have any investment in taking sides, but those conversations felt forced and artificial, and it was clear that trying to rekindle dormant friendships because of current desperation wasn't going to be successful. My dating apps were equally disappointing. The few matches I managed to get either lost interest quickly when I couldn't explain why I'd suddenly moved in with my cousin, or they were clearly only interested in casual hookups rather than anything that might help rebuild my social life. 2 weeks into my stay at Lisa's house, it was becoming clear that my exile from Ryan's life wasn't going to be temporary. He'd started dating someone new, which I discovered through mutual friends' social media posts that I could still see despite being blocked from his accounts directly. The new girlfriend looked exactly like what I'd expected. Younger, prettier, and probably had no complicated romantic history to share unfortunate comparisons about. She seemed sweet and uncomplicated in all the ways that I apparently wasn't, and Ryan looked genuinely happy in their photos together. Seeing them together was devastating, but not because I necessarily wanted Ryan back. It was more about realizing how quickly and easily I'd been replaced, like our 8-month relationship had been nothing more than a placeholder until he found someone better suited to his needs. Lisa's patience with my presence was wearing thin, especially since her toddler had started acting out because his routine had been disrupted by having a stranger in his space. She suggested that I might want to look into short-term furnished rentals or extended stay hotels while I figured out my longer-term housing situation. The financial reality of my situation was becoming increasingly stressful. I'd been splitting expenses with Ryan for months, and suddenly, having to pay for housing on my own meant I couldn't afford the same standard of living I'd gotten used to. My options were limited to sketchy neighborhoods and shared housing with strangers. My work performance was suffering as I struggled to focus on anything besides my destroyed personal life. I was making careless mistakes and missing deadlines, which led to an uncomfortable conversation with my supervisor about whether I was dealing with personal issues that were affecting my professional responsibilities. The therapy sessions I'd started attending were helpful for processing what had happened, but they also forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about my pattern of poor judgment in relationships. The therapist helped me see that my comment to Ryan hadn't been an isolated incident of poor timing, but part of a larger issue with boundaries and appropriate communication. I'd started having panic attacks in grocery stores and coffee shops, convinced that everyone was staring at me and judging me for being the woman who'd destroyed her relationship by comparing her boyfriend to her ex. The paranoia was probably mostly in my head, but the shame felt real and overwhelming. My family had heard about the situation through Lisa, and my mother called to express her disappointment in my choices and concern about my inability to maintain stable relationships. She suggested that maybe I should consider moving back to my hometown, where I'd have family support while I figured out my life. The idea of moving back home at 30 felt like admitting complete defeat, but it was becoming clear that staying in my current city wasn't sustainable. I'd burned too many bridges and destroyed too many relationships to rebuild any kind of meaningful social life in the same place where everyone knew my story. Dating had become impossible, not just because of my reputation, but because I was too emotionally damaged and financially unstable to be an attractive partner to anyone. The few dates I managed to arrange ended badly when it became clear that I was still processing the trauma of my sudden social exile. 3 months after the comment that destroyed my life, I was living in a studio apartment in the worst part of town, working a job that barely covered my expenses, and spending most of my free time alone because I'd alienated everyone who'd once been part of my social world. The apartment was a far cry from the comfortable space I'd shared with Ryan, but it was mine, and nobody could kick me out for saying something inappropriate during intimate moments. The walls were thin, the neighbors were loud, and the building smelled like cigarettes and despair, but it represented the only stability I had left. I'd tried reaching out to Ryan one more time through a mutual friend, hoping to apologize properly and maybe salvage some kind of friendship from the wreckage of our relationship. But the friend told me that Ryan had specifically asked people not to pass along any messages from me, and that he'd moved on completely. The therapy sessions had helped me understand that my comment hadn't just been about poor timing or too much wine. It had been a symptom of deeper issues with empathy and understanding how my words affected other people. I'd spent so much time focusing on my right to be honest that I'd forgotten about my responsibility to be kind. My dating life remained non-existent, partly because I couldn't afford to go out, and partly because I was too damaged and bitter to be good company for anyone. The few men who showed interest were clearly looking for something casual, and I wasn't emotionally stable enough to handle being treated as a temporary distraction. Work had become my only source of routine and purpose, but even there, I felt like an outsider. My colleagues were polite but distant, and I was never included in social activities or office gossip. I'd become a cautionary tale about mixing personal drama with professional relationships. The worst part was the constant replay of that night, the endless mental loop of wondering what would have happened if I'd just kept my mouth shut. The comment that had seemed so innocent in the moment now felt obviously cruel and destructive, but hindsight couldn't change what I'd already destroyed. I'd started taking sleeping pills because lying awake at night, thinking about my mistakes, was making me physically ill. But even medicated sleep was full of anxiety dreams about being rejected and abandoned by everyone I'd ever cared about. My mother visited once, and I could see the disappointment in her eyes as she took in my reduced circumstances. She didn't say anything critical, but her sadness about how my life had turned out was more devastating than anger would have been. Sometimes I drove past the apartment I'd shared with Ryan, wondering if he ever thought about me or felt any regret about how quickly he'd ended our relationship. But I knew that was just wishful thinking. He'd found someone better and moved on completely, while I was still stuck processing the consequences of my own poor judgment. The social media posts from my former friends showed them continuing to live their lives without me, attending parties and events that I'd once been part of. They looked happy and unaffected by my absence, which made me realize how little I'd actually mattered to any of them. The hardest truth to accept was that Ryan had been exactly what I'd needed, and I'd been too insecure and thoughtless to appreciate what we had together. He'd offered stability, affection, and genuine partnership, but I'd been more focused on what was missing than what was present. The comment that had seemed so innocent in my wine-influenced state had revealed something ugly about my character that I was still learning to acknowledge and change. I'd been cruel without meaning to be, and the unintentional nature of the hurt I'd caused didn't make it any less damaging. Now I lived carefully and quietly, monitoring every word and thought to avoid creating new opportunities for self-destruction. The spontaneity I'd once valued had been replaced by hypervigilance that colored every interaction and made genuine connection feel impossible. I thought honesty mattered in relationships, but now I'm starting to think maybe silence would have kept me warm tonight. Some truths are too destructive to share, and some comparisons are too hurtful to voice, no matter how accurate they might be. I'd learned that lesson too late to save what I'd lost, but early enough to understand what I'd destroyed through my own thoughtless words.